Our next session, rather, actually asks a question which could be unsettling. What happens to the very idea of global leadership when the world is under strain as we're seeing it right now? Across regions, we are seeing prolonged wars, we are seeing fractured alliances, economic insecurity, and institutions are struggling really to command trust. The assumptions that guided decades of diplomacy have been questioned. At such a moment, what does credible leadership really look like at home for us and on the world stage? To help us navigate these profound questions, we are honored to welcome Professor Monica Duffy-Toft. A very warm welcome. She's Academic Dean at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Thank you for being here, Professor. And I leave you with Mr. Sanghvi for another interesting conversation.
So what we're going to do is the professor is going to make a brief statement explaining the contours of her discussion, and after that we'll have a chat. Please start.
So good morning, and thank you for having me here this morning. I'm really delighted, and Veer, thank you for moderating this. So to start, I feel as if I was listening to the past, and obviously we were listening to the future. And what I mean by that is I was asked to talk about where we are in terms of the world order and leadership, and I've been working a lot on this idea about spheres of influence, which is a very old idea, right? We can go back centuries, and states and great powers sort of want to have control, sort of abrogate the autonomy of other states or other regions in order to have control, in order to control their foreign policy, not necessarily the currency, but their foreign policy, and who could move in and out in terms of trade, personnel, or people, or whatever. And what I'm arguing today, and why I think I'm talking about the present, and I don't know if it's going to be the future, as our esteemed Chinese professor was talking about, is that we're in an era of spheres of power. And what I mean by that is that the military still matters. Traditional political military power still matters. China's position matters. Taiwan's geographical position matters. It matters that the United States is pretty secure in the Western Hemisphere, which is why it can beat up on all its neighbors. So I'm not denying that military power and geography and territory is no longer important, but it now has to contend not only with economics, which has always been the case, right? The United States basically won World War II because of Detroit, but technology. And so I'm going to sort of underscore the point that was said in the earlier panel about the role of technology. And I think we are in a different era. Yes, in the 19th century, trains, steamships, the advent of the airplane, all very, very important technologies. But the technology that we're witnessing today is vastly different. And the reason is that it integrates with everything that we do, both militarily and economically. And so if you think about AI, cyber, the speed at which change happens, and we're seeing this every day, OpenAI, or we could talk about DeepSeek, they're releasing new models every day, and if you play around with these things, they're pretty extraordinary models. But we're also talking about technology of platforms, 5G. China's ahead on 5G, right? And so this technology that we're at, the speed of innovation, right? And then if you think about the cyber attribution, it's much more difficult. In the old days, when you think about military, we can think about the war in Ukraine. We saw the Russians coming. We watched them on TV. CNN showed them trying to get to Kiev and they got stalled. Whereas when you think about in the cyberspace, it's very difficult to have attribution. So it's much more speedy. It's much more difficult to get attribution. Not impossible. And then there's a blurring of the lines between the military, the political, and the economic. And this is new. So when I think about spheres of power, my argument, or how I'm thinking about it in terms of my work and in global politics, is that we're in a different era. That if the United States and China, and I agree with our former interlocutors, they are the big players here, although Russia is still sitting there. It's got a pretty big nuclear arsenal still, and it wants to play with the heavyweights. China and the United States are competing across these three domains. And one of the concerns is that it's going to lead to greater instability. And the reason is what I'm calling domain incoherence. And what I mean by that is that the United States historically has always wanted open and free trade. It's always wanted non-proliferation. It's always wanted to prevent regional hegemons. And historically, at least since the 1940s, advancing human rights and democracy. Well, all of that is sort of out the door with the exception of the regional hegemon, but the truth is, what is the United States trying to do? It's trying to prevent China from becoming a global hegemon. But in terms of democracy promotion and human rights promotion, we're not really doing that anymore under the current administration. Non-proliferation, this is President Trump's drive actually into Iran, that's still a commitment there. And then free trade, we don't know where we are. President Trump loves tariffs. And he loves slapping them on adversaries and allies alike. But the point is that in some ways the United States is still very open, but in other ways it's closing. And similarly, China would like free trade, but on its terms. It wants to be bilateral, it wants to control that free trade. And then if you think about the technology, it wants to share some of its technology, but other technologies it wants to keep close. And then militarily, I think they're both closed, although the United States, one of its superpowers has always been its alliances, but the Trump administration is making a hash of that. It's one of the things that we had. We could rely on our allies to have some burden sharing. We had bases around the world. So it's not clear that the United States, even militarily today, has that in its pocket the way it used to even 5 years ago. So the point is that what we're facing right now is competition of China and the United States across these different domains of power, economically, technologically, and then, of course, militarily. And it's going to be really hard to disentangle that. And my concern is that we project this out, and here I'm thinking 5, 10, 20 years out. I don't think we can project out further than that. It's going to lead to instability because there's going to be points of friction where we're on new ground. We talked about the technology in the last. China did steal trade secrets. There's no denial of that. That is how they got ahead, right? And they, in the 80s and the 90s. But then it started to sort of demand trade secrets in order for Americans to invest. That created tensions. But now it's innovating on its own. If anybody's been to China lately, it's extraordinary what China is doing in terms of solar, in terms of energy production, right? And green energy. But then, of course, in the cyber and AI space. So now it's innovating on its own, and what China's been a master at is deploying Western technologies, if you want to call that, and then innovating it for the local market. Is that stealing, or is that just being smart, right, and using those different technologies? So when I think about the world order as we move forward in terms of these domains of power...
I'm going to interrupt you because I have a quote from you saying that the world order as we know it is dead. Mm-hmm. You stand by that?
It is.
So
the rules are done, right? The United States, and I think Professor Mearsheimer did a brilliant job talking about in the 1940s, the United States erected the Western system of institutions, which China benefited from, right? The World Trade Organization, we can talk about the World Health, all these different organizations, the United Nations. But now you've got sort of the architect of all of that saying, no, we don't like those, we don't like multilateralism, everything's unilateral now, and it's transactional. Yeah. We need something for it. And from the allies even, it's no longer burden sharing, what we're seeing is burden shifting, and compelling our allies to take now.
I'm going to stop you again. Yeah. The question many people ask is when you say this, and many people say what you've said, it's essentially predicated on what Trump has done. You wouldn't have said this when Biden was president. So given that Trump has only 3 more years as president, should we be extrapolating on the basis of what he's doing?
Well, look, it's a fallacy to say that the Obama administration and the Biden administrations weren't compelling our allies to spend more. They were. Okay. Look, Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, and then it did it again in 2022, or 4 years in. In fact, 2 days ago, we celebrated the 4th anniversary of that invasion, that full-scale invasion. So, but I think the difference is that the Trump administration has done it just much more full-throatedly.
Yeah.
And I think Professor Mearsheimer is right. He doesn't like multilateral. He doesn't respect international institutions. And any law that he sees or regulation, he wants to figure out how to get around that.
Yeah.
He does that in his personal life, and he has done that as president in office. And so the idea is that moving forward, the issue is that let's say President Trump, I remember with the first administration, I was actually living in the UK.
Okay.
And I thought he's a blip. So I was looking at Brexit, is that permanent? And I was looking at Trump, and I thought Brexit's really bad for the UK.
Yeah.
And I left the University of Oxford in part because I really thought Brexit was going to be bad. And it has not been pretty for the Brits. It hasn't. So here we are, right, with Trump. And the problem is Trump has been elected a second time. He's a trend. And the more time he spends in office, now we're on our 5th year of his presidency, these institutions, he ends up putting in place new rules, new ways of doing things that become normalized so that the baseline changes,
Yep.
so that even if he steps off, and it's not a J.D. Vance in 2028, but it's, let's say, a Democrat, there's going to have to be a lot of unraveling that's going to have to be done, right, before the next administration. And we saw that under Biden. What was Biden's first job that he did when he came in after the first Trump administration? He ran to Europe. Because he wanted to say to the Europeans, we need to figure out how to, trust us as Americans. The problem is, it's going to be so much harder because the Americans have now elected Trump twice, seeming to validate his position. And with all these executive orders, the imposition of the tariffs, the treatment of our allies, going after Greenland, Venezuela, and all of this, it's going to be much harder to trust the American system. So it's not only coming from us, but from outside in as to whether we can recover from this.
I was going to ask you that. You're an American, presumably.
Yes, I am.
Does it matter to you that so much of the world hates America now?
Oh, it matters to me tremendously. Absolutely. No, in fact, I teach on this. I teach on U.S. foreign policy, and I follow the polling. And one of the most unnerving things, and by the way, this was even before President Trump, is that many, and I would say most citizens in most states around the world saw the United States as more of a threat than Russia and China.
Yep.
Now, that polling was before it was like 30,000. That was before 2022. I'm sure Russia has risen. And the reason for that is that the United States has really sharp elbows, and we tend to forget that as Americans. We're easygoing, happy-go-lucky, but the truth is we have very sharp elbows. I wrote a book on U.S. intervention policy since 1776. A quarter of the more than 450 interventions happened since 1991. Think about that, a quarter since 90. So how is the rest of the world going to interpret the United States? It's a bully, right? And so, yes, it bothers
But Trump
me.
enjoys being a bully. He wants to be known as a bully, right?
This administration really believes in a very machismo, very male, hate to say that, but a very machismo kind of bullyish. They think that that's a sign of strength. They don't believe in yielding. Here we are in South Asia. I did a lot of martial arts. There's no weaving and bobbing here. You're taking a direct punch from the Trump administration. And I'm sorry, a lot of the world doesn't believe in that. And also, it's not always the best way to approach your opponents, much less your allies, right? Is that you really do want to kind of yield and bend. And oftentimes it's like, bamboo, right? You want to be able to flex in the wind. And we're more like a rock, just lobbing them. So it is a real problem.
A related question, not strictly a foreign policy question, but people in India say, don't Americans see what this man is doing? How come he's still popular enough to stay in office?
Well, we'll see about this. Polling is not looking pretty for President Trump. He's at the lowest. I think he's 36%. And also, I have to tell you, just like I think in India, and in China, I bet as well, but this is why President Xi and the CCP want to keep that economy humming. They want to keep that middle class happy. It's economy first. And with President Trump running around the world, sending carrier and fleets to the Middle East and going after Venezuela, many Americans are not happy, actually, because they can't afford the food that they want to put on their table. Electricity prices are high. Energy prices are high. There's a housing crisis in the United States because mortgage rates are too high and people aren't, like me, aren't moving out of my house because I have a great mortgage rate, but my children can't get that rate. So President Trump's going to have a lot to pay for or a lot to be accounted for come the midterm elections.
I was going to say that.
Yeah.
Will the midterms make any difference? Will the party put pressure on?
Well, we've seen in some of the special elections that indeed the Republicans have been hurting. I mean, Texas, there was just a great analysis of Texas, which is you've seen turnout of Democrats that they didn't even know existed.
This is the special election.
Yeah, special elections in Texas. And so the sense is that assuming that everything is fair, there's no national crisis declared, I mean, we're seeing the Trump administration talking about having ICE or Department of Homeland Security deployed before the elections to try to intimidate some Americans from not voting. A lot of schemes. But assuming that, I think that potentially, you could see the Republicans lose not only the House, it was pretty clear they were probably going to lose the House, but now they're saying the Senate. And if that happens, then the President Trump's administration's ability to carry through with its policies, they're not going to be able to do it with the Democrats in control of the House and or the Senate.
But your view is that even if that happens, he's already done so much, well, for want of a better word, damage, that it'll take a long time for people to unravel it. And in the process, he shifted the goalposts so that anything that follows will be influenced in some way by Trump and the boundaries he set. Right?
Yes, I think that the trust in the United... Look, I wouldn't trust the United States right now. If I were a middle power, I'd be hedging quite a bit. You see this with Vietnam. You know, Cambodia is completely in China's camp. I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East lately. You just look at the Middle East and what the Gulf states are doing and other states, the Saudis, the Omanis, they're balancing between China and the United States because they understand that the United States has a credibility problem. And by the way, it's not just, President Trump. Look, President Biden and President Obama, because of the ineffective legislature in our country that has abrogated responsibility, it's not legislating. So what ends up happening is that the executive comes in, signs an executive order, and then what does the next executive do? Overturns those executive orders and re-implements its policy. So the big question mark is actually not about the executive, it's about our Congress and whether our Congress starts doing its job so that there's some certainty, there's some reliability, there's some stability in the execution of U.S. policy, both in trade, but then also foreign policy.
Okay. I've already lowered the tone of this somewhat by taking you away from foreign policy, so you won't mind the next question, I hope, which is that many people in America believe that there are elites at the top that control everything. Bizarrely, these people don't seem to believe that Trump is part of that elite, but therefore when they vote against liberals and elites and people who sell children at pizza parlors or whatever. Now you've seen with the Epstein files that there are elites that don't obey laws, that these guys all know each other, they all have sex parties, perhaps sleep with children. Do you think, therefore, this is going to make a difference to America's mood? Every paranoid person who believes in conspiracy theories will now believe that the American system is tilted towards the rich?
Yeah, it's so interesting. The Epstein files are global.
Yeah.
I think we're seeing that. And I think there's always been a global elite. So the idea that this is new, I think the difference here is that we had a gentleman, Mr. Epstein, Jeffrey Epstein, who was really good.
Possibly the first time the words gentleman and Jeffrey Epstein
Well,
have been used the same
I should have
sentence.
put it in quotes, but I have a mic in this hand. But in any event, he was really good about, I'm a post-Soviet, scholar, compromat, and hanging on to that kind of information. And it was global, and it's not just American. And what's so striking, of course, is that our European allies are all going after the individuals who are in those files, whereas in the United States, nothing there to see, except they did take down Ghislaine Maxwell, the woman, by the way, in this situation. And here's the deal. What's so striking about this is that, what MAGA is, Make America Great, again, that is the supporters of President Trump. They're really split on this. And it was actually the MAGAs who are a lot of conspiracies, and in this case, they're right. Just because you believe in conspiracy doesn't mean that there's not ever no validity to them. And so they're really split, which is why President Trump had to compel his Department of Justice to release this. And boy, they did a hash job on it, which has actually made it worse because now they really do believe there's even more there. Yeah. And each day, as more and more governments, and in particular France, Poland, Italy, Norway, I mean, they're doing full-throated, of course the UK, full-throated investigations, and as that happens, more and more of this is going to come out. And I think the Trump administration, they're keeping their fingers crossed that they can keep enough of this stuff tamped down before the midterms. Yep. And then maybe, I doubt it, but maybe they'll deal with it and have some prosecutions of some of these individuals.
Well, Howard Lutnick is fine despite everything that's come up.
I'm sorry, pardon?
Howard Lutnick is fine, despite all the revelations. So I'm not sure
Trump. He was his neighbor. Of course, he had a relationship with him.
No, he went to his island, invited him on his boat, and lied about it. So it's a little bit more than that.
Yes. Yep. No, that's right. But the idea, I don't think we want to delude ourselves and say that the elites, the absolute elites, played by different rules. I think that's always been the case. But in this instance, I think because of modern technology, social media, ability of cell phones, right, that it's just so easy now to record and to document. I don't think we'll likely see, I mean, we could talk about the Panama Papers. That was a huge where people
But that was just ignored, wasn't it?
No, there were some consequences. Again, the UK, remember Tony Blair? He took a lot of heat on that one. Prime Minister, what are you doing putting money into the Caribbean, right? So this has been around. I think the difference here is the magnitude, the global scale, and the ability of this one individual to collect a lot of information on a lot of different individuals across so many sectors of society.
We've got 5 minutes to the money question. How does all of this affect India? What should India do? What's in it? What's going to happen to us?
So I think India actually is well positioned. One of the interesting things I think about this moment that we're in is that the middle powers, and India is actually a major power. I mean, it has nuclear weapons. It doesn't have a lot of good neighbors. I think everybody saw their feeds. Pakistan has now declared that it's at war with Afghanistan, which is good for India. Yeah. He doesn't have to worry about Pakistan for a little bit. Sad for the two countries involved. But it gives you room for maneuver, right? Because then you can work with the United States and you can also work with China and also with Russia. We know that India was getting pretty decently priced oil as a result of the war in Ukraine. And so it just has to be really smart and think about the immediate, obviously, what kind of deals, but then the second, third, and fourth order effects of any policies or any agreements that it adopts going forward. I think Professor Mearsheimer is right. I mean, for India, the big thing is domestically, whether you can lift enough of the population out of poverty, get them educated, and then figure out how to integrate them into the economy. I think where the Middle Eastern states failed was they actually educated them, they had the wealth, but they didn't have the jobs that could then, and we ended up having the Arab Spring. You had this big youth. And I think India, and also Africa to some extent, demographic shifts is back here. I study a lot about demographic shifts. So I think for India is making sure, trying to harness the talent and the human capital in this country so that you don't get discord. And then dealing with potential allies, partners in trade, military, whatever it might be, India can kind of play it off. It can hedge between the different major powers.
Okay. You must have sensed talking to people in India, there's a sense of surprise, almost betrayal, because we believed that America was our friend. Prime Minister Vajpayee referred to us famously as natural allies. And during the first term of Donald Trump, there was a certain amount of genuflecting from our side, but it worked well and he was quite pleased. And now suddenly in the second term, at a very crucial moment for us, the war with Pakistan, he suddenly turned sides, took the side of Pakistan, has repeatedly made offensive remarks about India, and has in his mind this fantasy that he stopped the war and that millions of people would have died. And we don't quite know what we did to deserve this, and we don't know what his relationship with Pakistan is. So what should we do?
I think that you should look. My sense with President Trump is again we can return to that idea of the bully, because he's in a role in a position right now to be able to beat up on India. Yeah. He will. I think there is. I agree with Professor Mearsheimer. I think that he respects Prime Minister Modi. Prime Minister Modi is trying to do some good things for the country, but they do both have this idea, make America great again, make India great again, a very nationalist kind of idea. So I think right now, if I were India and I were advising Modi, is I would just stay on good terms with Trump, because that term mercurial was used, this term, he'll flip back around, because if he needs something from India, guess what? He's going to be knocking on the door of India and saying, okay, we're upset about China doing X or the Russian Federation doing Y. And India is a major player. I mean, the population is now the largest. It's got a big economy. The big issue is, like I said, the development piece, but that will come hopefully with good planning and good policy. In time, that will sort of develop properly.
You say stay on good terms with Trump, and of course I think all of us agree with that. But how far do you go? Do you say, yes, sir, millions of Indians would have died, and you stopped it, and you should get a Nobel Prize, as the Pakistanis have said, and Trump has admired? I mean, there are limits to which India will not go, and yet there are things Trump expects. So how do we handle that?
Yeah. So no, I mean, look, one of my favorite Cosmopolitan covers, Cosmo the magazine, was, how do you keep your man? You massage his ego. Right? That's how you keep your man, right? So I think with Trump, you're right. It feels kind of dirty, kind of gritty to have to do that. But this is a guy who thinks a lot of himself. And so what I think you have to do is find your balance, how far you're willing to go. And I have said this publicly. He could be an extraordinary president of the United States. He has so much power at his fingertips now, thanks to our Congress, which is not doing its job, and a Supreme Court that's allowing him to take more and more, although the tariffs, we can talk about that. But he could really be an extraordinary president. And so what I think you have to do is figure out where you're comfortable and where you can go. Because he does have a lot of power. Some of the things he's trying to do, I think he's right about some aspects of China. And just figure out where you're comfortable with saying, yes, Mr. President, that is correct. And then just ignoring where you feel as if you can't go there because that would violate some sort of, for you, some sort of value set. Because I agree with you. I would not be a groveling person to him. But I think there are some things that you could approach and say, yes, this has been helpful, this hasn't been helpful.
But keep him sweet, but stop from groveling. That's the red
figure
line.
out what parts of the ego
you will agree
it's a
difficult one. Yeah, it's a difficult one.
Because there are going to be, how does this, find those. Find those seams and sort of pull on those seams.
Great. Thank you. Our time is up. It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
ABP আনন্দ এগিয়ে থাকে এগিয়ে রাখে।